The original sin of the elves, the act that stained an entire race and echoed through ages of grief, was not a battle against a Dark Lord. It was a horrific slaughter of their own kin. An act of fratricide so profound it makes the War of the Last Alliance seem a noble crusade. This was the first spilling of blood by elf against elf, a wound in their very being that would never truly heal. To understand this horror, one must first understand the light that was lost. In the blessed realm of Valinor, before the sun and moon, the world was lit by the two trees, Telperion the silver and Laurelin the gold. Their light was the light of bliss, captured by none save the most gifted craftsman to ever live, Fëanor, prince of the Noldor Elves. Into 3 great jewels, the Silmarils, he wove their light. They were the most beautiful things ever made, desired by all who beheld them. And most of all, they were desired by Melkor, the first and greatest of the Dark Lords, whom Fëanor had renamed Morgoth, the black foe of the world. Morgoth, in his jealousy, allied with the primordial spider creature, Ungoliant. Together they ascended the green mound of Azelohar, and they destroyed the trees, drinking their light and spewing a venomous, absolute darkness over the land of the gods. Valinor was plunged into a suffocating night, its joy turned to mourning. But Morgoth's evil was not finished. He stormed the fortress of Fëanor, slew his father Finwë, the High King of the Noldor, and stole the Silmarils. He fled the Blessed Realm and escaped across the sea to his ancient northern fortress in Middle-earth. The grief of Fëanor was a cataclysm. It was a bottomless abyss of sorrow that immediately curdled into an incandescent rage, a fire that threatened to consume the world in its heat. He stood before the assembled Noldor in their city of Tirion, lit only by torches against the profound darkness, and his voice was like a trumpet of war. He railed against the cowardice of the Valar, the divine guardians of the world, whom he blamed for failing to protect his father and his jewels. He spoke of vengeance, of freedom, and of reclaiming the light that was stolen. He called upon his people to abandon the land of the gods, and to follow him into the unknown lands of Middle-earth, to wage an eternal war upon Morgoth. But how could a quest for righteous vengeance against the ultimate evil lead to the murder of one's own brethren? The answer lies in the oath that he swore. It was an oath of such terror and power that none have ever dared to swear its like again. In that desperate darkness, Fëanor and his 7 sons raised their swords and swore by the very name of the supreme being, Ilúvatar, to pursue with vengeance and hatred any being, be it elf, man, Mahia, or Vala, who should take or withhold a Silmaril from their possession. They invoked the everlasting dark upon themselves if they failed. They were not merely making a promise, they were shackling their souls to a singular, all-consuming purpose from which there was no escape, save victory or death. This was the Oath of Fëanor, and its poison was already beginning to work. A great part of the Noldor were swept up in Fëanor's fire. They were a proud and adventurous people, eager for the wide-open lands of Middle-earth, and to rule realms of their own. They turned their backs on the Valar, and began the long march out of their blessed home, an exile of their own making. They marched for leagues upon leagues, a river of shining steel and bright banners flowing through the eternal twilight of Aman. Their goal was the coast, and the sea that separated them from their enemy. But the great sea was vast, and to cross it they would need a fleet. Fëanor had no ships, but he knew who did. Along the shores of the Blessed Realm dwelt the Teleri, the third and last of the elven kindreds to arrive in Valinor. They were the sea elves, lovers of water and masters of shipbuilding. Their chief city was Alqualondë, the haven of the Swans, where the lamps were of pearl and the harbor was filled with the most beautiful ships ever conceived. These ships were the life's work and greatest joy of the Teleri. They were carved in the likeness of swans, with golden beaks and eyes of jet and amber. The Noldor and the Teleri had long been friends. The Noldor had gifted them countless jewels which adorned their city, and the Teleri had taught the Noldor much of music and the sea. Fëanor, therefore, went to them believing they would aid his cause. He found their king, Olwë, and spoke to him with urgent, fiery words. He told of Morgoth's evil, of his father's murder, and of the Noldor's resolve to depart and seek vengeance. He called upon the friendship between their peoples and demanded that the Teleri join them in their war, or at the very least, lend them their magnificent fleet for the crossing. But Olwë was aghast. He could not believe what Fëanor was proposing. To rise in rebellion against the Valar, the very powers who had brought them to this blessed land, was madness to him. He counseled his friend to abandon this reckless path, to return to Tirion and seek the pardon of the gods. Of the ships, Olwë, Parwa's answer was absolute. "We do not lend our ships," he said, "for they are to us as the gems of the Noldor are to you, the work of our hands, into which our hearts are woven. We will not give them to aid any war against the will of the Valar." For the Teleri, their ships were their life's work, living things. To give them away for a war they believed was folly was unthinkable, and this refusal would cost them everything. Fëanor's pride, already stretched to its breaking point by grief and rage, could not endure this refusal. He saw it not as caution, but as betrayal. "You renounce our friendship in our hour of need," he snarled, his voice low and dangerous. "But a locked door is no hindrance to one who must pass. We shall have your ships, one way or another." He returned to his Noldoran host, and waited for his moment. Impatient, bound by his terrible oath, and seeing no other path forward, he made a fateful and horrific choice. He would not wait for persuasion. He would not seek another way. He would take what he needed. He commanded the first and most loyal of his followers to advance. They moved swiftly along the great piers and began to man the swan ships, preparing to cast them from their moorings. The Teleri were thrown into confusion and alarm. They cried out, asking what madness this was, that friends should act as thieves in their own haven. The Teleri had few weapons, for they were a people of peace, but their courage was great. As the Noldor began to board their beloved ships, they resisted. They swarmed the piers, attempting to cast the invaders back into the sea. They formed a living wall before the ships, determined to protect the work of their hearts. Fëanor and his host, their blood now hot with urgency and anger, drew their swords. The light of the eternal stars, the only light left in the blessed realm, glinted upon bright, naked steel. A cry went up, a shout of defiance from the Teleri, and a roar of rage from the Noldor. And so the battle began. The first blow was struck, and the first blood was spilled upon the undefiled shores of the land of the gods. It was the first kinslaying, elf against elf, in the very heart of paradise. The Noldor were warriors, trained in the arts of the forge and the sword. The Teleri were mariners, singers, and craftsmen. It was not a battle. It was a slaughter. The white piers of Alqualondë ran red, and the serene waters of the Bay of Eldamar were clouded with the blood of its makers. But the Teleri, though outmatched, fought with a desperate courage for their homes and their beloved ships, and they began to overwhelm Fëanor's vanguard through sheer numbers. Victory for the Noldor was not assured, and it is here that the tragedy deepens, twisting into a knot of lies and misunderstanding that would poison the Noldor for ages to come. What turns a desperate fight into an unforgivable massacre? The arrival of help that believes it is joining a different war. Fingon, leading the second and largest host of the Noldor, arrived at the haven of the Swans to find a battle already raging. From a distance they could not hear the words, only the cries. They could not see the cause, only the chaos. They saw bright swords and flashes of Noldoran armor, and they saw their kin falling, beset by a great force of elves upon the piers. They made a fatal assumption. They believed the Teleri had attacked the Noldor, seeking to prevent their departure at the command of the Valar. They believed this was an ambush, a trap. They saw their brothers fighting and dying, and without a moment's hesitation, they drew their own swords and charged. With the arrival of this second, mighty host, all hope for the Teleri was lost. The fight became a brutal, one-sided butchery. The cries of the sea elves were drowned out by the war horns of the Noldor, and their courage was broken under the weight of steel. Thrice the Teleri were assaulted, and thrice they were driven back, until their king, Ulwe, cried out to Ase, the Maya of the seas. But Ase did not come, for the Valar had forbidden any interference in the departure of the Noldor. They were to walk this path of their own free will, and suffer all its consequences. The haven of the Swans was taken. A great number of the Telerin mariners were slain, their spirits flying in grief to the halls of Mandos. The Noldor, now murderers, now kinslayers, manned the white ships and turned their prows towards the open sea. As they mastered the vessels, for few among them had any skill in seamanship, a great storm rose from the ocean, a sign of Ase's grief and anger. The sea itself mourned the Teleri, and many of the stolen ships were wrecked, swallowing their thieves into the cold, dark depths. But the majority of the fleet, guided by Fëanor's unbending will, survived the storm. They sailed north along the coast, a grim flotilla under the cold light of the stars. And now, a new problem arose. The ships were not enough. The Noldor were a vast people, and the fleet they had stolen, though magnificent, could not carry them all in a single journey. Murmurs began to spread. Who would go first? Who would be left behind? The host was divided into two main groups: those who followed Fëanor out of fierce loyalty, and the larger group who followed his half-brother Fingolfin, more out of a sense of duty and a reluctance to be parted from their kin. The animosity between the two brothers had never healed. Fingolfin argued for fairness, for a crossing in stages, where the ships would ferry one group and then return for the other. But Fëanor had no intention of sharing. In the dark furnace of his heart, he had already decided. He saw Fingolfin and his people not as kin, but as a burden. He remembered their reluctance in Tirion, their counsel for caution. He despised them for it. He feigned agreement, and then, under the cloak of night, he gathered his own followers, the most zealous and loyal, and boarded the ships. Quietly, they cast off their moorings, leaving the vast host of Fingolfin sleeping on the shores of a now hostile land. It was Maedhros, Fëanor's eldest son, who questioned him. "What of my cousin Fingon?" he asked. "The valiant, who just saved us. Surely you will send ships back for him?" For Maedhros and Fingon had once been the dearest of friends, and Fëanor laughed. A terrible, chilling sound. "Let them who cursed my name curse me still," he said, "and wind their way back to the cages of the Valar. Let them rail down the bitter road. As for the ships, let them burn." He considered those he had abandoned as baggage, traitors to his cause, and he had no intention of ever letting them follow him. Upon reaching the shores of Middle-earth, Fëanor gave his final, terrible command. He ordered the Telerin ships, the most beautiful vessels ever made, the price for which they had stained their hands and souls with the blood of their own kind, to be set ablaze. The fire was so great that the sky to the north glowed with a mighty red light. It was the first new light seen in that part of the world since the fall of the two trees. Across the vastness of the sea, Fingolfin and his people saw it. They saw the distant gleam of a great fire, and knew, with a dawning, soul-crushing certainty, what it meant. They had been betrayed, abandoned, left to perish, or return to Valinor in utter shame. There was no way back. The Kinslaying had made them pariahs, and the Valar had closed the way. They were trapped between an unforgiving sea and the memory of their crime. But Fingolfin was not his brother. His heart was not filled with fire and spite, but with unyielding courage and a love for his people. He would not lead them back in shame. If Fëanor had taken the sea route, Fingolfin would find another. There was one other path to Middle-earth, a path of such terror and despair that it was thought impassable. The Helcarax, the grinding ice, a narrow strait in the uttermost north, where the frozen seas were filled with a constant shifting and crashing of mountains of ice, and the cold was a living, malevolent force. To cross it was madness, but to a people fueled by betrayal and a desperate will to live, madness seemed the only way forward. But what if the burning of the ships was more than just spite? What if that colossal blaze, seen for leagues, was not merely a message for the abandoned, but a signal, a declaration of war? For Morgoth now knew his most hated foe had arrived. The signal was received. Deep beneath the triple peaks of the Thangorodrim, in the bottomless pits of Angband, the Dark Lord stirred. He had felt the light of Valinor return to the world, and it filled him with a rage that shook the very foundations of the mountains. An army of orcs, bred in darkness and hate, was unleashed. They poured forth from the gates of Angband like a black tide, their purpose not to wage a careful war, but to sweep the intruders back into the sea from which they had come. But they had not reckoned on the Noldor. They had not reckoned on the light of Ahriman, nor the fire of Fëanor. He did not wait for the attack. With the first glint of orc blades on the horizon, he gave a great cry, and his host, alight with a terrible wrath, charged to meet them. This was the Dagor Nuin Gileath, the battle under stars, the first clash between the darkness of Morgoth and the exiled light of the Eldar. The Noldor were outnumbered, but their fury and power were a new thing in Middle-earth. Their swords were sharp, their bows were swift, and their hearts were ablaze. The Orcish host was utterly routed, fleeing back towards the mountains. But for Fëanor, victory was not enough. Vengeance was all. Drunk on the thrill of his first triumph, he laughed and spurred his horse on, far ahead of the main body of his army, his eyes fixed on the peaks of Angband itself. He would tear down the gates of his enemy and reclaim his Silmarils alone if he must. But his pride had led him into a trap. As he neared the foothills, the fleeing orcs turned, and from the shadowy clefts of the mountains, new foes emerged. They were not orcs. The Balrogs of Morgoth, demons of the ancient world, fell upon him. Long he fought, undaunted, a single flame against a legion of darkness. His sword was a shard of starlight, his shield a defiant blaze. But he was alone. He was surrounded. Gothmog, the lord of Balrogs, struck him a mortal blow. Though Fëanor fought on, ringed with fire and covered in wounds, his strength began to fail him. He would have been slain, his spirit dragged down to the halls of his foe. But at that moment, his sons, leading a vanguard of Noldor, charged in with a desperate cry. They drove the Balrogs back with a sudden assault of elven wrath and steel, lifting their dying father from the field. They carried him back towards the hills, but as they crested a rise, Fëanor bade them halt. He knew his hour had come. With his last strength, he looked upon the distant, smoking peaks of the Thangrodrim, the fortress of his great enemy, and he cursed the name of Morgoth 3 times. A curse of such power it echoed in the stones. He made his 7 sons swear again to uphold their dreadful oath, to pursue the Silmarils to the end of the world no matter the cost. Then he died. But so fierce was the fire of his spirit, that as it fled his body, it consumed the flesh, and he passed like smoke and ash. His was the greatest and most tragic of all the Noldor. He brought his people to Middle-earth, but would never see them forge a kingdom. He won the first battle, but would never see the war. His death marked not an end, but a beginning. The beginning of a long and bitter war, of great deeds and sorrows, of hope and despair. The age of the elves in Middle-earth had begun, forged in betrayal and christened in fire and blood. The legacy of Fëanor was now in the hands of his sons, and the shadow of their oath would stretch over all the ages to come. The story of the Noldor in Middle-earth is a saga of heroes and monsters, of kingdoms rising and falling, and of a light that would not be extinguished. We have only just witnessed its dawn. To see the wars that followed, to witness the valor of Fingolfin, and to uncover the fate of the Silmarils, make sure you subscribe to the Silmarillion Chronicles. The legend